My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and to most people, I'm just the friendly woman who runs a little bakery on the corner. They see flour on my apron, a smile on my face, and they think that's the whole story. But what they don't know is that every cupcake they laugh at, every small hobby they dismiss, hides a truth they could never imagine. For years, my brother's rich family mocked me at the dinner table, telling me I wasn't part of real business. What they didn't realize is that the very empire they brag about has always been mine. And when they finally sat down to brunch in a restaurant they thought belonged to someone else, the truth shattered their pride in a single moment. What would you do if the people who underestimated you most suddenly discovered that you were the one they had been admiring all along? Stay with me, because this is the story of how the sweetest revenge came not from anger, but from letting them taste the truth with their own mouths. The smell of cinnamon and warm bread wrapped around me as I turned the key and pushed open the glass door. Morning light slid across the counters of Sweet Haven, catching on the polished jars of sugar and the little bell that would soon ring with the arrival of my first customers. This bakery had been my stage for 8 years, and to the people of Cleveland who stopped by for coffee or a pastry, I was simply Emily Carter, the local baker who remembered their children's birthdays and their favorite drinks. They saw flour on my apron, a smile on my face. What they did not know was that Sweet Haven was only the surface. At night, when the ovens cooled and the lights dimmed, I stepped into another life. Casa Verona, the Italian fine dining chain with 28 restaurants across the country, bore my fingerprints in every detail. Last year's revenue alone crossed $280 million, though here in Sweet Haven. I balanced coins in the register as if that was all there was. My customers would never guess, and certainly not my family who thought baking was a pastime, not a profession. My brother Daniel was their pride, the one born to inherit, while I was tolerated as the eccentric sister who liked sugar more than steel. As I placed a tray of blueberry scones onto the display, the memory of my mother's voice pressed itself into my thoughts. Emily, dear, how is that little bakery of yours? Perhaps you should think about attending more social events. Daniel has an important gala next week, and it would be beneficial if you looked presentable. Her words, wrapped in sweetness, but sharpened with condescension, stung more than she would ever admit. My father had only nodded in agreement, his eyes avoiding mine, as if even acknowledgement was a burden. Their approval had always been reserved for Daniel the Golden Son. For me, they offered sighs and polite dismissals, the kind that cut deeper than insults. I had learned to swallow my retorts, to smile instead of fight, but there were moments when silence felt heavier than stone. I wiped flour from my hands and tried to shake the thought away, focusing instead on the rhythm of the morning. The bell chimed, and the first customers arrived, the kind who had been coming for years. Marco, my head baker, handed me a tray with a grin, his dark hair already dusted with flour. "You act like this place is the whole world, Emily," he teased, though he knew better. Thomas, my manager, was bent over the ledger at the counter, his sharp eyes catching every number, every detail. To them, Sweet Haven was more than a business. It was loyalty. It was family. And I never took that for granted. As I poured a latte for a young mother, she leaned close, her voice carrying the quiet weight of exhaustion. "Emily, this bakery is the only place I feel like myself. The only place I feel at home." Her words caught me off guard, pressing into me with unexpected force. I smiled warmly, sliding her cup across the counter, but inside, I felt something stirring. Home. Belonging. Shelter. Her gratitude was real, and it reminded me why I had started Sweet Haven in the first place. Yet at the same time, her words pulled against the chain of my family's judgment, against years of being told that what I built was nothing more than a hobby. I moved through the morning rush, handing out pastries, greeting neighbors, laughing at small jokes, all while my mind drifted. My family thought this was all I was, a woman content with butter and sugar. They never knew the contracts I had signed under a different name, the late nights in boardrooms, the international chefs who answered to me. They never knew they had dined at my restaurants during their lavish galas, praising the elegance of Casa Verona, never realizing their own daughter was the architect behind it all. They adored what I created while dismissing the hands that built it. That irony had become my shield, and one day it would become my weapon. By noon, the cases were nearly empty, the smell of baked bread lingering in the air like comfort. I sat for a moment behind the counter, staring at the chalkboard menu I had written myself, its edges smudged from years of erasing and rewriting. Sweet Haven looked small, unassuming, but to me it was the perfect disguise. My family never looked past it, never cared to ask. They laughed at my cupcakes, toasted Daniel's skyscrapers, and believed the world was balanced in their favor. They had no idea that the balance had already shifted. I stood and straightened the counter, brushing crumbs into my palm. Tomorrow would look the same on the surface. Customers would arrive, Marco would hum while kneading dough, and Thomas would shake his head at my messy notes in the ledger. But beneath it all, I was preparing for something else, something that could no longer be hidden. They thought I was only a baker. Soon they would see that sweetness can be deceiving, that beneath sugar and cinnamon there can be something stronger, sharper, waiting to be tasted. I grew up in a house where everyone knew exactly who the sun revolved around and who was expected to live in the shadows. From the earliest days, I can remember my brother Daniel was the chosen one, the golden child. His laugh echoed louder, his accomplishments were celebrated brighter, and every door seemed to swing open at the mere mention of his name. And me, I was the one who learned to slip quietly along the edges of family gatherings, praised only when I stayed small and unnoticed. Daniel was destined for real estate, a world of marble floors and glass towers. He wore his suits like armor, navy, and charcoal, with silk ties that glimmered beneath boardroom lights. He spoke in polished phrases, perfect sound bites about multi-million-dollar projects, his voice trained to command a room. To outsiders, he was the embodiment of success, the man everyone wanted to shake hands with. And my parents loved nothing more than to bask in his glow. My father, Robert, 65, would sit at the head of the table, his heavy silver watch catching the chandelier light as he listened to Daniel talk. He never interrupted, never doubted, only nodded with solemn pride, as though each word were scripture. My mother, Margaret, 62, leaned in with adoration, her eyes soft glowing like she was gazing at a young king destined to rule. Their son, their pride, their proof of legacy. And me, I was the daughter who baked cookies. I remember the day of my 22nd birthday not because of balloons or laughter, but because of the silence that followed my words. I had spent weeks typing up a simple business plan, laying out my dream for a bakery in the heart of Cleveland. I printed it on crisp paper, bound it neatly, and carried it into my father's study, as though I were offering him a piece of my soul. The room smelled of leather and old wood, heavy curtains swallowing the daylight. My father sat behind a desk so large it looked like a throne-polished mahogany that gleamed between us like a barrier. I placed the folder down with careful hands, trying not to tremble. I asked for $20,000. Not a fortune, not compared to what I had watched flow so easily toward my brother. Just enough to begin. My father's eyes skimmed the pages. He did not lean in, did not linger. His brow stayed smooth, unreadable, until he closed the folder with a single sharp click. The sound echoed through the room like a door slamming in my face. He looked at me, then his gaze as cold as marble. "Emily," he said, his voice low but final, "a woman's place is with her family. Do not waste your time on foolish hobbies." The air left my lungs as if he had struck me. The words weren't simply a refusal. They were a sentence, a verdict on who I was and what I could be. 1 month later, Daniel received several $100,000 from the family trust. The papers were drawn up by the attorney with efficiency, the ink still wet with approval. No questions asked. No hesitation. My parents stood beside him, proud and smiling, ready to launch him toward his future. The contrast was like fire and ice. I had been told no with disdain, while Daniel was handed everything with reverence. The sting was not about money. It was about value, what they saw in him and what they refused to see in me. That night, as I lay awake in my small apartment, the laughter from family dinner still ringing in my ears, I felt humiliation seep into my bones. My mother had added her own dagger in the living room, her words laced with pity as she sipped her wine. "Emily, dear," she said with that practiced smile, "desserts are for children's parties, not for serious business." Her voice carried the weight of dismissal, the kind meant to sound gentle but sharpened with intent. I saw the faint curve of her lips, the sigh behind her words, the silent judgment that my dreams were nothing but a frivolous game. Her words cut deeper than my father's refusal. They weren't just a rejection. They were erased. To her, I was not a woman with ambition. I was a child, and my dreams were toys. The memory of that moment has never left me. Even now, I can recall the way the crystal glass caught the light in her hand, the way Daniel smirked as if the verdict confirmed what he already knew, that I would always be less. But that night in the quiet, I made a vow. A vow sharper than any blade, heavier than any insult. I would build something greater than they could ever imagine. I would do it without their money, without their approval, without their trust. And when it stood tall before them, unshakable and undeniable, they would have no choice but to see me. That vow became the fuel for every sleepless night. It was the reason I stayed in the bakery kitchen until dawn, my hands blistered, my back aching, my eyes burning from exhaustion. It was the reason I sketched menus on scraps of paper, tested recipes, until my skin smelled of sugar and yeast, and carried bags of flour heavier than my own body. Every loaf I pulled from the oven was more than food. It was defiance. Every tart cooling on the counter was proof that I was more than a shadow. Years later, Daniel still commands the room at family gatherings. He arrives in his tailored suits, his voice rising above laughter, recounting deals with skyscrapers and high-rises that sparkle against the Chicago skyline. My father beams, his face carved into pride. My mother clutches Daniel's arm as though proximity to him is her greatest treasure. Their friends applaud. The cousins nod. The air fills with admiration as though Daniel were sunlight itself. And me, I sit with my coffee, smiling politely, listening to their chorus of praise. But inside, I carry a truth they cannot touch. The empire I have built quietly, brick by brick, recipe by recipe, already surpasses the shine of Daniel's deals. The name they love to drop at cocktail parties, Casa Verona, belongs not to some faceless magnate, but to me. The restaurants they dine in, the ones they praise as elegant and flawless, are mine. They do not know it yet. They still laugh at cupcakes, dismiss pastries as hobbies, and look through me as though I am made of smoke. But the balance has already shifted. Their throne, their golden air, their false certainty, it is all an illusion. And very soon, when the veil lifts, they will see. For the first time in my life, they will have no choice but to see me. Thanksgiving in most American families is a sacred ritual of gratitude, filled with the warmth of shared dishes and gentle laughter. In my family, it was a stage, a carefully arranged theater, where Daniel always played the star, and I was cast as the background. Each year I sat at the long, gleaming table in the Carter Mansion in Chicago, trying to fit into the role of the dutiful baker sister. The smell of roasted turkey filled the dining room, but beneath it hung a sharper scent, one I knew too well, the faint edge of judgment that never quite left the air. The table was a spectacle set with white linen napkins, pressed into stiff folds silver that caught the chandelier's light, and plates piled high with sides that would have made any magazine cover proud. I smoothed the napkin across my lap, the coarse fabric scratching against my skin, a reminder of the discomfort that always accompanied me in that room. My hands, so steady when coated in flour, trembled slightly as I lifted my fork. It was not fear, but a restless energy I had carried for years, the energy of being pushed aside too many times. Then Daniel entered, and as always, the air seemed to tilt toward him. He strode in wearing a navy suit, tailored to perfection, his tie knotted with the care of someone who expected to be admired. He flashed that smile, the practiced blend of confidence and charm, and launched into his monologue. Tonight, it was about a new real estate development, a project he insisted would reshape the skyline of Chicago. His words filled the room like banners hung high above us, proclamations of triumph. My father Robert nodded with solemn pride, his expression carved into admiration. My mother, Margaret, leaned forward, her eyes shining with something close to worship. Around the table, cousins and uncles murmured approval, and I felt myself shrinking smaller with each sentence Daniel spoke. I cut into the slice of turkey on my plate, the juices running across porcelain that cost more than a week of groceries, and I realized with sudden clarity that I did not belong there. The laughter, the boasting, the endless applause, it all felt like a foreign country. I sat in it year after year, but never once felt its citizenship. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts, gentle as honey yet sharp enough to wound. Emily. Dear, I'm sure you've had plenty of fun selling those little muffins at your shop, haven't you? The question floated into the air laced with sweetness, and then the ripple of laughter followed. It wasn't loud. That was the cruelty of it. It was refined, polite disguised as family banter, but sharper than any open insult. It burned more deeply because it pretended to be nothing at all. Daniel leaned in, seizing the moment as he always did. Success, Emily, requires scale, strategy, and influence, not pastries wrapped in paper bags. His words were smooth-honed by years of playing the role of superiority. My cheeks flamed heat crawling across my skin. The food before me blurred colors bleeding together until the feast looked dull and lifeless. The familiar weight of humiliation pressed down heavy and relentless, as if the very air around me conspired to crush me. In that silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the hum of Daniel's self-satisfaction, my eyes lifted by accident and met Olivia's. She sat beside him, her posture straight, her dress a shade of deep green that caught the light. She was the fiancée, the woman who had appeared in carefully curated photographs online, smiling beside my brother at galas and charity events. Tonight her smile was absent. She did not laugh with the others. Her gaze held mine for a fraction longer than expected, steady and unreadable. In that glance I saw no mockery. If anything, I saw hesitation, perhaps even a flicker of empathy. It startled me because empathy was the one thing I had never been offered at that table. The moment passed as the conversation turned back to Daniel's triumphs, my father raising his glass in another toast. The room swelled with approval, their voices like waves pulling me under, dragging me back into the undertow of smallness they had always assigned me. I reached for my wine, the glass cool against my fingers, and forced a smile onto my lips. It felt like a mask, brittle but necessary. Inside, though, another voice whispered louder than ever before. This is Thanksgiving in my family. A performance of pride and subtle cruelty. But this winter will not be the same. They believe I will always be the little baker content in a corner. Tomorrow, I promised myself in silence, tomorrow they will learn the truth. The silverware had quieted the clinking of knives and forks, giving way to the slow lull of conversation. The Cabernet in our glasses had dwindled to crimson stains on the crystal, and yet the tension at the table did not ease. If anything, it thickened, clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. I knew what was coming. My family never let a holiday pass without reminding me of my place. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his arms stretched lazily along the carved mahogany frame, the picture of entitlement wrapped in an expensive suit. His voice carried across the table, smooth and confident. Tomorrow, I am taking new partners to brunch at Casa Verona. That is where real business happens. Prestige, not little bakeries tucked on some corner. His eyes flicked toward me, a smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth, and the laughter rose again, polite but sharp. My father let out a low chuckle, the kind that signaled approval more than humor. My mother followed, lifting her glass with a smile so practiced it looked carved into her face. At least there, she said, her gaze cutting through me like glass, we won't have to sit through any more talk about cupcakes and sugar. Each word struck harder than the one before, like wine being poured not into a glass, but across my skin, staining me in front of them all. Under the heavy damask tablecloth, I curled my hands into fists. My nails bit into my palms, leaving half-moon marks that burned in silence. 3 years I had endured this holiday after holiday, playing the mute spectator while they performed their ritual of pride. I swallowed the insults, dressed them with a polite smile, and convinced myself that silence was strength. But tonight, something inside shifted. The reservoir of patience stretched thin across years finally ran dry. Olivia sat across from me, quiet, as she had been all evening. The fiancée of my brother, polished and graceful, her presence at the table was meant to amplify his shine. Yet she did not laugh. She did not join in. Her eyes moved between Daniel and me, steady, conflicted, as if she saw the undercurrent no one else cared to notice. In her silence, I felt an unexpected recognition. For the first time that night, I realized I was not entirely alone in this gilded cage. I placed my glass down softly enough that the sound barely carried. But in the pause that followed, it echoed inside me like a drum. I raised my head, and for the first time in years, I met Daniel's eyes without flinching. His smile faltered just for a second, as if something in me unsettled the script he had been reading from all his life. My pulse thundered, a wild bird battering against the cage of my ribs, but my thoughts rang with a clarity I had never felt before. Enough. This is the last time. A calmness settled over me, unexpected and steady. I felt my lips curve into a small smile, one that none of them could interpret. They would see it as defeat, perhaps, or acceptance. They had always underestimated me. But inside that smile marked something different. It was the first brick in the wall I was about to build, the first spark in a fire they could not extinguish. Daniel turned back to his wine, confident his jab had landed, confident that the silence meant victory. My mother sipped delicately. My father reached for another piece of turkey, the conversation beginning to move again. They did not know what had just taken root in the quiet between us. They did not know that their final insult was no longer simply endured. It had been absorbed, transformed, and reborn as something they could not anticipate. I looked around the table one last time, memorizing the scene. The chandelier light glinting off silver, the practiced laughter, the carefully drawn smiles. It would not look the same to me again. The weight I had carried for years lifted, replaced with something sharper, cleaner. A resolve that tasted almost sweet. They believed they had won. They believed I was nothing but a shadow in the Carter family, a baker content with scraps of dignity. But tonight, I decided. Their final sneer would be the first crack in the mirror they had polished for themselves. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The November wind bit against my cheeks as I pulled away from my parents' mansion, the leather of the steering wheel cold beneath my palms. Outside, the night was sharp and brittle, but inside me, there was fire. For 3 long years I had sat through their dinners, swallowed their disdain, and let their words of mockery settle into my skin like frost. Tonight was different. When I closed the car door, the sound echoed with finality. It was more than a click of metal. It was a vow. By the time I reached my apartment overlooking the skyline of New York, the fire inside me had crystallized into clarity. The city lights glittered like thousands of watchful eyes, each one daring me to move forward. I slipped off my coat, dropped my keys onto the marble counter, and reached for my phone. My hands no longer trembled. With steady fingers, I typed 3 words I had been waiting years to send. Protocol family. Now. The message flew into the night. Marco's reply appeared almost instantly. Understood, boss. Then Thomas followed. It will be ready by morning. Relief came, but not the kind that softens. It was the kind that sharpens a blade honed at last. I walked into my study, my sanctuary. The walls were covered with blueprints for new Casa Verona locations, sketches of restaurant interiors, menus, annotated with my handwriting numbers scrawled across sheets of quarterly earnings. Yet for all the paper and ink, what caught my eyes first was not the contracts or the charts. It was the framed photograph above my desk. My grandmother Rosa smiling gently in her kitchen flour dust on her apron, her hands resting on a bowl of dough. Her eyes, warm even in black and white, seemed to look at me still. She had taught me that passion was the only true capital, that resilience was the strongest currency. And in that moment, her gaze steadied me more than any document ever could. The Carters believed success was inherited, passed down like silverware or trust funds. They never understood that success could be carved from nothing shaped with flour-dusted hands and sleepless nights. They called me an outsider, a disappointment. Tomorrow they would sit in the very empire they dismissed as a hobby, and they would see who had truly built a business worth respect. I picked up the phone again and called Claire Miller, my closest friend and the sharpest financial strategist I knew. Claire had been with me from the beginning when the idea of concealing ownership seemed not just ambitious but impossible. She answered on the first ring. "Everything is ready," she said, her voice brimming with assurance. "The holding company, the NDAs, the entire anonymous structure. They won't be able to deny it tomorrow." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Tomorrow. The word itself was heavy, pulsing with promise. And in that wait, I thought of Sweet Haven, its chalkboard menus smudged with flour, the bell above the glass door ringing in, welcome the smell of cinnamon that wrapped itself around tired customers who found shelter there. That little bakery had been the disguise, but it was also the root. Without Sweet Haven, there would have been no Casa Verona. Without Rosa's voice in my memory, there would have been no reason to fight this hard. I turned back toward the glass wall of windows. The city stretched before me like an ocean of light. I caught my reflection in the glass, and for a moment I barely recognized the woman staring back. She was not the silent daughter at the dinner table shrinking under the weight of ridicule. She was not the little baker they laughed about. She was the architect of something enduring, someone who held her destiny with unshakable hands. The night outside was restless horns echoing from distant streets, the hum of traffic rising and falling like a tide. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of the city beneath my fingertips. Behind me, Rosa's photograph watched over it all. A thought surged through me, steady and unbreakable. Tomorrow I will lead them into my world. And when the truth unfolds, the heads that always held so high will be forced to bow. When I set the phone back down, silence pressed against me, heavy and complete. The city beyond my window pulsed with noise and light, but in my study all I could hear was the echo of the past. Before tomorrow's confrontation, before the moment everything would be revealed, I needed to remember where it all began. Every insult, every sleepless night, every scar left by hot ovens and sharper words. The journey rose in me with clarity as if someone had opened a book I had closed long ago. It was 2010. I was 22, fresh out of college, my head bursting with dreams and my hands restless to shape them. I had no trust fund, no safety net. What I did have were my grandmother Rosa's recipes passed down with love and patience, each one a thread in the fabric of her life. I walked into the local bank, the smell of old coffee and floor wax filling the air, and asked for a $50,000 loan. The branch manager, Mr. Henderson, looked at me over his glasses, his suit stiff as his smile. His eyes swept over my worn jeans, my second-hand blouse, and then narrowed with condescension. "A small bakery, is that right?" he asked slowly, as if the words themselves amused him. "Do you really think you can manage repayments, young lady?" My hands trembled when I signed the papers, but somewhere deep inside, Rosa's voice steadied me. "Emily." She had always said everything begins with a handful of flour. From there, a loaf is born. The first months were brutal. I was the baker, the cashier, the cleaner, and the delivery driver. My palms blistered from oven trays, my back ached from carrying sacks of flour heavier than I was, and my eyes burned from staying up past dawn. There were nights I fell asleep with my cheek pressed against a bag of flour, because the exhaustion left me no choice. Loneliness clung to me like a second skin. The world outside kept moving, but inside that little bakery time was measured in batches of dough, and the sound of the doorbell chimed the only applause I received. By 2012, Sweet Haven had become a neighborhood favorite. People came for my scones, my grandmother's apple pie, my stubborn insistence on making everything by hand. Mothers brought their children, old men lingered over coffee, and for the first time I felt I had built something that breathed. But to everyone else, I was just Emily the baker. They saw the cozy storefront, the loyal but limited crowd, and assumed that was the extent of my ambition. They didn't know that by night in the silence of my apartment, I was building something far greater. While flour dusted my apron at dawn, contracts littered my desk at midnight. Claire was the only one who knew. My best friend since college, she had become my secret weapon. With her legal brilliance, we created Verona Ventures, a holding company that shielded my name. She drafted airtight NDAs, brought in nominee directors, and built a fortress around my identity. But ambition is cruel. In 2015, everything nearly collapsed. Our boldest step yet, a flagship Casa Verona in New Jersey, failed spectacularly. The numbers bled red, the dining room sat empty, and one night, I found myself in a bare kitchen, the smell of failure sharp as vinegar. My head in my hands, tears dripping onto the tiled floor. I thought of Rosa and for the first time wondered if I had betrayed her faith. There were employees waiting for paychecks I couldn't cover. My phone screen blurred through tears as I dialed Claire, bracing for her disappointment. Instead, her voice came calm, firm. "I'll wire you the money," she said. "But you have to promise me, Emily, you will not give up." I promised. Through gritted teeth, through sobs that hollowed my chest, I promised. That vow became the steel in my spine. I will never forget the morning I stood in Sweet Haven flour, still smudged across my apron, as I unfolded the New York Times. The headline leapt at me. Who is the anonymous owner behind the Italian empire, sweeping New York customers lined up for their usual croissants and muffins, calling me by name, unaware that the same hands wrapping their pastries had signed contracts for a growing chain of fine dining restaurants. I smiled to myself as I served them a private, quiet smile. They didn't know. My family certainly didn't know. The dream they dismissed as childish was conquering an entire city. That smile stayed with me. It was not the smile of someone content with crumbs. It was the smile of someone underestimated, someone who had turned ridicule into resolve. Someone who had built from nothing what others thought could only be inherited. Now standing again in my study, I let my eyes rest on the signed contracts for Casa Verona's international expansion. Every sleepless night, every burn scar on my hands, every moment I had cried alone in a dark kitchen had led me here. It was a cruel journey, a merciless teacher, but it had made me unbreakable. And in the quiet of my apartment, I heard Rosa again, not warning this time, but affirming. They thought you couldn't stand without them, but you've built this with your own hands. I pressed my palms together, the faint ridges of old burns still etched into my skin. Tomorrow my family would sit at my table not as loved ones, but as guests in a world they never believed I could build. And for the first time, I was ready to let them taste the truth. The morning after that dinner, I folded clothes into my suitcase with hands that refused to stay steady. My flight to New York was only hours away, and yet the air felt too thick to breathe. Just as I zipped the bag, a notification lit up my phone. A message from a cousin I rarely heard from family meeting. Parents clarifying the trust fund. I froze, the words pressing down on me like a stone. My pulse quickened. Of course I already knew what the outcome would be. But still my thumb hovered, my breath uneven before I opened the audio file they had slipped to me. My father's voice filled the quiet room, sharp and deliberate. Daniel will be the main heir of the Carter family. He has the intellect and the strength to uphold our reputation. Emily, she has chosen her own path. She is not fit to bear that burden. I felt my throat tighten. The words were as cold as the November wind outside my window. Then came my mother's voice, smooth and edged with disdain. I could almost see her pursed lips, her dismissive smile. She has her little bakery. That is enough for a woman. Real business belongs to Daniel. He is the future. The phone nearly slipped from my grasp. I stood in my small apartment, staring at nothing, the recording still playing. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. For a moment I was 22 again, standing before them with my business plan trembling in my hands, begging for support, only to be dismissed with the same cruel certainty. They had not changed. Not one bit. But I had. I had built Casa Verona 28 locations strong, a brand whispered with admiration across the country. I had paid wages to hundreds of employees, balanced budgets under impossible strain, survived failures that could have ended me. And still in their eyes, I was invisible. A woman with a hobby, disposable. Daniel, with his failed deals and constant rescues, was still the golden boy. They wrapped him in safety nets, covered his mistakes, and praised him for ambition he never had to earn. And me, I was expected to smile sweetly, sell cookies, and stay out of the way. The recording went quiet for a beat. Then my father's voice delivered the final blow. The trust fund will go entirely to Daniel. This is the final decision. Something broke inside me. But it wasn't a weakness this time. It was a sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. A laugh. Low, bitter, disbelieving. It startled me, echoing off the walls. They thought this was the end. That erasing me from the legacy would silence me. That shutting the door meant I had nowhere left to stand. But tomorrow they will sit in the private dining room of Casa Verona. My house, my world, my rules. I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket, my hands steady now. My gaze fell to the flight ticket resting on the table, its bold letters spelling out New York. The city where everything had begun, where I had clawed my way from nothing to everything. I pressed my palm against the glass window, the skyline of Cleveland faint in the distance. My reflection stared back at me. Not the timid baker they remembered, but the woman who had carried fire through years of ice. Inside my mind, the words were steady, deliberate, unshakable. They chose Daniel. They believe I'm unworthy. But tomorrow when they sit at my table, they will know. They will see with their own eyes who the true heir is. The evening had settled into a heavy stillness, the kind that clings to the skin when autumn leans into winter in New York. My suitcase stood by the door, the cab was waiting below, and with every step I felt closer to leaving behind the suffocating air of the Carter estate. Then my phone lit up. The name on the screen made me pause. Olivia, Daniel's fiancée. We had never shared anything beyond polite exchanges. She was a fixture at family gatherings, always perfectly composed, the woman who stood at Daniel's side as he basked in the family's admiration. I was the shadow at the edge of the room, present but invisible. Yet her voice that night was different, low and soft, carrying a strain I had never heard before. "Emily," she said, almost a whisper, "are you free? I need to talk." There was something raw in her tone, an urgency that pulled me in despite the part of me that wanted to walk away. Against every instinct, I agreed. We met at a small cafe tucked near the train station, a place I had often gone to escape into quiet corners. The hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine filled the room. Olivia sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She glanced around, her eyes restless before letting out a long breath. "I'm not used to the way Daniel's family treats you," she finally admitted. Her voice was fragile, almost ashamed. "They're harsh, too critical." I gave her a thin smile, the kind I had practiced for years. "I'm used to it." The words sounded hollow even to my own ears, yet it was the only shield I had left. Her silence stretched heavy between us. She ran a finger along the rim of her cup, the faint clink of porcelain breaking the pause. At last she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Before I went to Columbia for law, I spent a summer at the Culinary Institute of America. One of the first places I visited after was Casa Verona. I ordered the tiramisu, and I cried. My breath caught. Casa Verona, my Casa Verona. The restaurant was born out of exhaustion and fire of recipes whispered by my grandmother Rosa, of nights when my hands bled from kneading dough and my heart beat with nothing but determination. I wished I could meet the person who created it." Olivia continued, lifting her eyes to mine. They glistened with something I couldn't name. "Because whoever they are, they have a soul. You can taste it." For a moment I could not speak. Her words pierced deeper than any insult my family had ever given me. Recognition. Sincere, uncalculated recognition. My family had spent years reducing me to a nuisance, a hobbyist, a woman better off forgotten. Yet here was Olivia the outsider about to marry into the Carters, acknowledging the soul behind my work. I studied her face. There was admiration there, but also something more fragile, a tremor beneath the surface. She wasn't like them. She loved Daniel, yes, but she didn't carry the Carter arrogance in her blood. She was navigating her own storm, caught between loyalty and doubt. She placed the cup down with a soft clink, her hand trembling slightly. "Emily." She whispered, her voice breaking. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, if Daniel is really the man I should build a life with." The air thickened. Her words lingered trembling in the space between us. I held her gaze, feeling a truth unfolding, not yet spoken aloud, but alive in her hesitation. I did not answer her question because it was not mine to answer. Instead, I offered her a small smile, one forged from years of pain and clarity. "There are things, Olivia," I murmured, "that reveal themselves with time. Truth has its own way of coming to light, even in the most unexpected places." She looked at me as though she wanted to say more, but instead she nodded, her jaw tight, her eyes shimmering with something unspoken. When she finally rose to leave, her figure framed by the dim cafe lights, I watched her walk away, her silhouette both fragile and determined. I sat there long after she had gone, the sound of chairs scraping, cups clinking, and voices rising and falling around me fading into nothing. What remained was the echo of her confession, the weight of her doubt, and the knowledge that tomorrow she would be there when the truth surfaced. A whisper rose in me, steady and unyielding. Tomorrow those eyes would be my witness. And when the veil finally lifted, Olivia would understand. Not everyone in the Carter family lived by glitter and arrogance. Some of us had built something real, something with a soul. The morning air in New York was sharp, the kind that usually woke every sense, but today it only made me restless. I arrived at Casa Verona's flagship before the city truly stirred, when the streets still carried the hush of dawn and the restaurant doors remained firmly shut against the chill. Inside, silence ruled, broken only by the rhythmic chop of knives and the distant hum of ovens. The scent of yeast and warm bread filled the vast, empty dining hall, a perfume that always grounded me, though today it carried an edge of anticipation that pricked my skin. My staff stood in quiet rows as I walked in, their expressions solemn, almost reverent. Not fear, no, it was something closer to shared purpose, as if they too understood what this morning meant. My heart, usually a frantic bird at times like this, beat steady and strong. Casa Verona was no longer just a business. It was my arena, and today the audience would be my own family. Marco approached, his voice low, as though even the walls might betray us. "Protocol family is in place, Miss Carter. The VIP dining room is arranged exactly as you envisioned, Grandma Rosa's portrait in the center, the timeline of each restaurant framed on the walls. Everything is ready." Thomas followed, a tablet in his hand, his tone efficient, but tinged with something deeper, pride perhaps, or loyalty. "The Carters are scheduled at 11. We'll guide them through the main hall past the wine cellar so they can see every stone, every brick, every bottle you've built into this place." I nodded without a word, my throat too tight to answer. I didn't need to say thank you. They knew. Every one of them had stood by me through the nights of doubt, through the years of building this empire in silence. Their quiet loyalty was woven into every corner of this restaurant. Time moved slowly, each minute drawn out like a string pulled taut. My body was calm, but my mind surged with memory. I thought of every Thanksgiving where I was the punchline, every dinner where my name was spoken with pity or ridicule. Today the stage was mine, and they would be the ones forced to sit and watch. At 11 sharp, the heavy oak doors opened. My family entered as if stepping into a theater, their posture rigid with entitlement. Margaret, my mother, led the way, her smile polished and professional, the kind that charmed donors and silenced opponents. She addressed the maitre d' with the same commanding lilt she used on board members. "We are the Carters. We have a reservation with the owner of Casa Verona." From the surveillance room, I leaned closer to the monitor. The corners of my lips curled. They had no idea whose domain they were about to enter. Daniel walked just behind her, adjusting his silk tie with an air of someone stepping onto a stage. He leaned toward my father and whispered his words caught clearly by the mic I'd insisted Thomas place near the entrance. "They'll see the connection, Father. They'll understand the weight of our family name here." Robert gave a curt nod, his jaw tight with the authority he had always believed was his birthright. Their pride was palpable, almost suffocating the same pride that had crushed me for years. Thomas appeared then immaculate in his suit and gestured politely for them to follow. His composure was perfect, betraying none of the truth he carried. He led them through the main dining hall, their eyes flicking over the chandeliers. The marble floors, the vaulted ceilings filled with quiet opulence. My father's gaze lingered on the wine cellar, his eyes lighting with recognition of the rare vintages displayed. Daniel puffed his chest as though he were the one being honored. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Thomas opened the door to the private dining room, ushering them in with practiced ease. The air inside was warmer, intimate, lined with history they did not expect. Olivia was the first to notice. Her steps faltered as her gaze locked on a faded photograph hanging at eye level. A younger me flower dusting my apron stood beside Grandma Rosa in the narrow kitchen of my very first bakery. My grandmother's gentle smile radiated from the frame, her hand resting on my shoulder, as though passing her blessing into the future. Olivia froze her eyes wide, her lips parting slightly. She saw it. She understood. The rest of my family barely looked. To them it was decoration, a quaint nod to some forgotten culinary past. But I saw the shift in Olivia's face, the recognition, the dawning realization that this story was not Daniel's, not my parents', but mine. From my seat in the security room, I exhaled slowly. A smile, genuine and unforced, spread across my face. For once, it wasn't the strained smile of defense or survival. It was the smile of someone who had endured and was finally standing tall. They had walked willingly into my world, breathing the air I had crafted, sitting in the chairs I had chosen, surrounded by the legacy they dismissed. Every dish they would taste carried the weight of my years in silence. The irony didn't sting, it soothed. I didn't need to raise my voice or confront them with accusations. The truth was already written into every detail of the room. They thought they came to claim prestige by association. Instead, they would dine inside the very empire they had mocked, blind to the fact that the baker they ridiculed was the architect of their supposed triumph. I leaned back, my pulse steady. Soon I would step out from behind the curtain, not with rage, but with the quiet dignity of a woman who had carved her place with her own hands. And when that moment came, they would finally see me. I stood just outside the polished mahogany door of the private dining room, the muffled clinking of silverware against porcelain echoing through the wood. My heart beat a relentless rhythm in my chest, not of fear, but of anticipation sharpened to a blade. Margaret's laughter, bright and triumphant, spilled into the hallway. She was certain they were minutes away from being introduced to the powerful owner of Casa Verona, a man perhaps or some faceless figure who had built an empire worthy of their admiration. They had no idea that the person they were waiting for was me. For a moment, I let them live in their illusion. I listened to the scrape of knives, the pour of wine, the murmurs of expectation rising like a chorus. It was almost poetic the way they celebrated a victory that had never been theirs. Then I reached for the handle, my fingers steady, and pushed the door open. The room stilled instantly. Conversations cut short, laughter strangled mid-breath. All eyes turned to me. I stepped inside wearing a tailored black suit, its clean lines framing me in power. Silver cufflinks caught the light, a deliberate contrast to the flour-stained apron they had always associated with me. Gone was the girl they dismissed as a hobbyist baker. Standing before them was the architect of the very empire they revered. Daniel froze mid-toast, his wineglass trembling in his hand, until the ruby liquid spilled across the white linen, seeping like blood into cloth. Margaret's eyes widened, her lips parted in a silent gasp, the smile she had carried seconds earlier dissolving. Robert's brow furrowed, his face hard to read, half disbelief, half the dawning realization of a truth he had refused to consider. I said nothing at first. The silence was louder than words pressing against the walls demanding acknowledgement. And then it was Olivia who spoke. Not Margaret, not Robert, not Daniel. Olivia. She looked at me, her eyes unblinking, then turned toward the framed photograph on the wall. The one of me years younger, flour dust on my apron standing beside Grandma Rosa in that cramped bakery kitchen. Her gaze moved back to me, and in that fragile space between seconds, I saw the pieces fall into place for her. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a bell. That's you, isn't it? I met her eyes, and did not flinch. Yes, it's me. I own Casa Verona. The room erupted without sound. It wasn't noise that broke the air, but shock raw electric. Daniel's grip gave way entirely, his glass shattering against the floor with a sharp crack. Red wine streaked across his polished shoes, though he didn't notice. Margaret clutched the tablecloth, her knuckles pale as though the fabric could anchor her in a world tilting out of control. Robert sat back stone-faced, but the rigid line of his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. Olivia did not recoil. Her eyes glistened with something that startled me respect. A flicker of awe softened her features, followed by the slow, deliberate nod of someone who had long suspected more than she was told. She knew now, and she believed. I walked forward and took my place at the head of the table, the seat they had always reserved for Robert, the seat I had never been invited to occupy. The hush stretched thick and heavy, every pair of eyes on me, every breath held as though waiting for the ground to shift beneath them. "Welcome," I said, my voice calm, deliberate, and resonant. I rested my hands on the polished wood, the gesture steady, claiming, "Welcome to my restaurant." No one moved. The chandelier's light cast a glow on the crystal glasses, but the sparkle no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. Inside, my thoughts swirled with years of memory, nights spent bent over ovens, mornings filled with exhaustion, evenings endured in silence while they mocked me across gilded tables. For so long I had carried their disdain like chains, invisible but heavy. Now those chains lay shattered at my feet. Margaret tried to speak, her lips trembling as though searching for words, but only a broken syllable escaped. Robert's eyes darted from me to the photograph, to the decor steeped in Rosa's memory, as if trying to piece together the years he had willfully ignored. Daniel, pale and sweating, pressed a napkin against the spilled wine, as though cleaning the mess could undo what had been revealed. Only Olivia looked at me as though she finally saw the whole of who I was. Her silence wasn't denial. It was recognition. The room seemed to exhale, though no one had spoken. In the stillness, my voice inside me rose not in anger but in vindication. This was more than a brunch. It was a reckoning. For the first time, they sat at my table, not as judges, not as critics, but as witnesses. And I, no longer the dismissed baker in their eyes, was the one who held the truth in plain sight. This was justice served not with fury but with undeniable clarity. The air in the private dining room pressed down like a heavy curtain, every breath weighted with tension. Daniel sat across from me, shoulders rigid, his usual swagger shriveled into something brittle and uncertain. Margaret straightened in her chair, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier, but her hands betrayed her trembling slightly as they clutched the edge of the polished table. Robert gripped the armrest so tightly the tendons in his hand strained white, as if holding himself together was the last effort he could manage. And me, I poured another glass of Cabernet, the ring of crystal against crystal, slicing through the silence. To anyone else it might have seemed casual, but to me it was deliberate. I wanted them to hear that sound, to watch the calmness of my hand, to feel how utterly in control I was. I tapped my finger lightly against the table. A signal. The door opened and Thomas stepped in his presence, quiet but commanding. He set a thick leather-bound folder on the table, its weight making a dull thud that echoed like a verdict. Behind me, the screen on the wall flickered to life, filling the room with shifting slides of charts, maps, and photographs. In the last 8 years, I began my voice, steady, unhurried. Casa Verona has expanded into 28 locations. This year's revenue stands at $280 million. International expansion is already underway. Contracts are signed for London and Toronto, and negotiations are advancing for Paris. The projector hummed, clicking softly with each new slide. Revenue graphs climbing images of sleek storefronts from Boston to Miami to San Francisco. Photos of grand openings with lines of patrons spilling into the street. Each slide was a strike of truth dismantling their illusions piece by piece. Their faces shifted like a painting cracking under pressure. Daniel's flush deepened, crawling up his neck until his skin burned crimson. He slammed his palms against the table, voice shaking not from disbelief, but from desperation. This isn't possible. You're just a baker, selling pastries at some farmers' markets. I met his eyes, unblinking, my lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Yes, a baker. A baker who built the empire your family worshipped without realizing who stood behind it. Margaret's voice broke through softer wavering. Emily, how could you keep this from us? From me, why hide? I leaned forward, my tone sharp but even. No, Mother. I didn't hide. I simply had no reason to tell you. The truth is, none of you ever wanted to know. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Silence rolled over her like a tide. Then Olivia rose from her chair. The scrape of wood against the marble floor startled them all. She stood tall, her gaze sweeping the table, settling on each face with a clarity that stung. Her voice rang with the conviction of someone who had finally chosen a side. While all of you mocked Emily, she was building one of the most respected brands in the country. That she gestured at the glowing screen where Casa Verona's story unfolded is real business, not the hollow deals you brag about at cocktail parties. Daniel lurched forward, his face contorted, words ready to spill like venom. But Robert's hand shot out, pressing firmly against his arm. The gesture was subtle yet absolute. Daniel froze. In Robert's eyes I saw it, the flicker. A reluctant acknowledgement, fragile but undeniable. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was the first crack in the fortress of judgment they had built around me. I straightened in my chair, letting the silence stretch my gaze, sweeping across their pale faces. The charts glowed behind me, proof no denial could erase. These weren't just numbers or photographs. They were the monuments of my endurance, the fruit of nights spent burned and blistered in kitchens of mornings, waking to rejection of years, swallowing humiliation, until it fermented into strength. I spoke again, my words deliberate, each syllable weighted with the history they had dismissed. You taught me that power meant money and status. Today you sit in front of both, not from your doing but mine. The empire I built with flour-dusted hands and unshakable resolve now stands as proof of what you never believed. And on this board, you're out of moves. The room held its breath. They had no response. Not Daniel's rage, not Margaret's elegance, not Robert's silence could alter the truth that now filled every corner of that room. The private dining room was steeped in silence so thick it clung to the walls. The last fork scraped softly against porcelain, dragging the final bite of tiramisu across the plate. The air was heavy with cocoa and shame, two flavors that did not belong together, and yet they lingered, impossible to ignore. I let my eyes wander slowly across the table. Daniel sat stiff and small, stripped of the bravado that had carried him all his life. His eyes avoided mine, darting like a child caught in a lie too heavy to hide. Margaret's hands clutched her napkin, the white linen wrinkling beneath her trembling grip, her pearls no longer shining with superiority, but hanging heavy against her neck. Robert the patriarch, whose word had always been iron, cleared his throat, and for the first time his voice faltered. Emily, he said, his tone low, almost hoarse. We were wrong. We did not see you, not truly. The words hung there, broken pieces of humility. Yet Daniel remained frozen, locked in his own silence, the weight of truth pressing too hard against him. Then Olivia, who had been quiet, placed her hand gently on my shoulder. Her touch was light, but the meaning in it was undeniable. A silent ally. A recognition. Perhaps even admiration. I felt the swell of years inside me, all the moments of ridicule, of being pushed aside, of swallowing the sharp edge of their dismissal. A part of me longed to laugh bitterly, to spit back every word they had thrown at me. To say, "Look now. Do you see who I am?" But instead I heard Rosa's voice, my grandmother's wisdom, as clear as if she were sitting beside me. "The greatest victory, little bird, is not to strike them down, but to make them see the light." So I rose from my chair, letting the scrape of wood echo through the silence. My voice was steady, unshaken. "I do not need your apologies. I do not want your trust fund. What I want is for you to understand that every time you mocked me, every time you dismissed me, you were unknowingly living on the work of my hands." I paused, then turned my eyes on Daniel, holding him there. Real business is not found in inflated contracts or empty prestige. It is found in flour on your apron, in sleepless nights spent chasing perfection, in the sweat and sacrifice that turns a fragile dream into something real. No one spoke. No one dared. The room was thick with their shame, their silence louder than any words could have been. The next morning I returned to Sweet Haven, my bakery, my sanctuary. The key turned in the lock, and the familiar bell above the door sang out bright and unchanging, a sound that had never once betrayed me. The scent of cinnamon and sugar wrapped around me, soft and warm like a friend's embrace. A young mother came in, her baby asleep in her arms. She smiled as she asked Emily, "Do you have any cinnamon rolls today?" I smiled back, sliding a fresh tray onto the counter, steam rising from the golden swirls. Her eyes lit with gratitude, and for a moment I felt something deeper than triumph. I felt at peace. I no longer needed the Carter family's recognition. I had found another family here among those who valued the quiet strength of my work, who tasted the care baked into every loaf, who believed in the worth of what I created. That was a victory, the truest kind. And as I watched her leave, the bell chiming once more, my voice whispered inside me, sometimes the sweetest justice is simply living your truth and letting them see it for themselves. As the bell above the door chimed, and the young mother smiled, holding her warm cinnamon roll close, I felt it deep inside me. I didn't need the Carter family's recognition. I had already built a family here, one made of trust, of gratitude, of people who saw value in what I created with my own hands. That was a victory. Quiet, steady, and real. And perhaps you know that feeling too. Perhaps you've lived through moments when others doubted you, laughed at you, or dismissed what you loved most, only for you to prove them wrong simply by standing firm in your truth. Have you ever had to show your worth to those who couldn't see it, or found success in a place no one thought to look? If this story touched something in you, I would be honored if you shared your experience in the comments. And if you'd like to walk alongside more stories of resilience and hidden strength, please like and subscribe to stay with us. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge is not anger, but living fully, proudly, and letting your light shine where no one can dim it. Thank you for listening, and may you always have the courage to keep rising even when no one